Hi everyone, welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. Once again, I'm your host, David Thompson. Today I'm joined by Dr. Barton Myers, who is an assistant professor of history at Washington and Lee University, and the recent author of Rebels Against the Confederacy, North Carolina's Unionists, which is now out with Cambridge University Press. So Dr. Myers, thank you so much for coming on today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Dave. I really appreciate it.
Now, I think when a lot of people are studying the Civil War, thinking about the war, and they think Unionists in the South, they're probably going to just jump right into the assumption of the border South. And they're going to think that you're referencing people in Maryland and Delaware and places like Missouri. But not necessarily North Carolina is going to be the state that comes first to mind. So with that being said, why don't you offer us just a little bit of an overview of what this book really is about?
One of the things I wanted to do with this study, I actually came at it from a completely different direction initially whenever I began the research about 10 years ago. I wanted to understand guerrilla warfare in the state of North Carolina. But I discovered quickly after spending about 6 months researching that I really wasn't going to be able to write the kind of history that I wanted to without looking specifically at the Unionist population and their whole story before, during, and after the war. Unionists were such an integral part to guerrilla warfare. I felt like in order to tell the comprehensive story I wanted to about irregular conflict, I was going to have to focus in on this group and tell the story in that way. So one of the reasons why I focused in on North Carolina, an interior Confederate state, a state that seceded, was there had always been a perception that North Carolina was very divided. But there had never been any sort of scholarly analysis of the entire state's dissident population. And so what I did was I started to go in and really research that, and that became the question. Who were the people who were born in North Carolina who remained loyal to the antebellum Union of States, the antebellum Union as they conceived it? And they don't even all agree on what the definition of Union is. But one of the things that united them was their belief that the Union was indissoluble, that it was perpetual. And these are the group of people that I studied before, during, and after the war and tried to tell the story of. And my way in was to look at a range of different types of records. The Southern Claims Commission records, which we can talk a little bit more about, was a key, but also service and pension records, which I analyzed very carefully for the men who joined the Union Army out of the state of North Carolina. Confederate conscription records, what remained of those, because that's one of our best windows into the local Confederacy and how they dealt with dissent and dealt with and used counter-irregular warfare themselves. Memoirs and diaries, the few that remain from people who were Unionists. So a range of different sources make up the base of the study.
I wonder actually if we could continue with the sources, because I thought of that a little bit when I was thumbing through this, thinking, you know, you're trying to uncover a narrative here that at times may be obscure, at times may be covered up for propaganda reasons by both sides. So you're uncovering it, and it might be a story that is going to change over time, and obviously it does, and I think we'll get into that when we get into Reconstruction and how this experience in North Carolina is remembered. So why don't you offer a little bit more here about Southern Claims Commission and some of these other sources, perhaps some of the pitfalls and benefits of working with these types of sources for your project?
Well, one of the first things I felt like I was going to have to do was create some sort of quantitative database in order to calculate who these people were, what their lives had been like from a qualitative perspective. And the Claims Commission records give us a way of quantifying, in some extent, Southern Unionism. So that's one of the reasons why people who work on unionism in general have to use the Claims records. They're our most comprehensive source at the state level within the South in order to use them. They're an imperfect source, and you have to go in initially very skeptical of the source itself, which led me to a very long period of looking at not just the allowed claims, but also all of the disallowed claims from North Carolina, which all told, that probably took me about 4 months to transcribe all of the material from both the allowed and the disallowed claims after I had them all electronically saved. But I think that the claims sort of work as almost like a South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission after the war. You give people who did not have a voice during the war an opportunity to tell their story for the first time. And yes, they were incentivized. There's the possibility of them getting money out of the system, but only about 1/3 of the people who testify in front of the Claims Commission actually get any money out of them at the end of the day. The bureaucracy of the federal government got really, really good at ferreting out charlatans who made claims of loyalty. They sent local people and interviewed people within counties in order to ferret out people's individual loyalties. So the Claims Commission records are interesting, but you have to go in initially very skeptical of them. And one of the things I wanted to do was look at that first. So there's actually an appendix to the book that looks at all the disallowed claims as well to assess how good of a job the claims commissioners did at looking at loyalty on the ground. So just with that source, it was a bit of an issue, and it took probably all told about 2 years to deal with that issue and that question. But the source that I found even more fascinating were the remaining sources of the Confederate conscription officers at the local level, because that enabled me to go in and actually map out irregular warfare and counter irregular warfare in some parts of the state, and discover something which I think is pretty interesting, and that's that the Confederate congressional district lines and old U.S. congressional district lines tell us a lot about where dissent emerges, where violent dissent emerges, and how it's ultimately dealt with. Confederate conscription officers were organized as essentially along the lines of the old congressional districts. So when they talk about what's going on, they're talking about what's going on within those districts, which is great because then you can actually see those lines of dissent emerge. So those two types of sources overlapped, enabled me to get at a range of different issues.
So we reached the war, well, I should say we reached the presidential election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln wins. The South begins to secede. Obviously, North Carolina is a bit later to the party relative to some of the other states in the Deep South. But I wonder, what are these Unionists doing in the winter of 1860 into the spring of 61? And once war's declared, North Carolina secedes. How are they reacting to the fact that they are no longer a part of the nation that they hold so dear?
Yeah. North Carolina's secession process is interesting. They hold a referendum in February of 1861, which draws out a lot of people publicly to talk about loyalty, to talk about their feelings. And in February of 1861, the referendum in the state actually goes down. They vote not to hold a secession convention. But after April 1861, after the firing on Fort Sumter, the majority of people in North Carolina, the majority of white people who could vote, go over to the Confederacy. In May, they host a very hastily organized secession convention. They don't put it out for a statewide referendum, and they take the state out of the Union. It's one of the last 4 southern states to go out after April of 61. But interestingly enough, North Carolina becomes one of the backbones in terms of manpower of the Army of Northern Virginia. 4th in raw enlistment totals, 2nd by the size of its white male population, just behind Virginia in terms of being that sort of backbone for the ANV. But during this whole process, from December of 1860, when South Carolina goes out, to May of 1861, you have vigilance committees emerging at the county level persecuting people. You have people making public statements about their political loyalty, and that's going to continue to haunt them for the rest of the war. And what you end up seeing, what remains of the Unionist population by May of 1861, I estimate it somewhere around 4 to 6% of the male population remains loyal to the Union. At that particular point, out of about 495,000 men in the state. So it's a small group, but that small group causes a lot of problems for the Confederates over the course of the war.
Yeah, and let's get into these troublemakers a little bit. How do they actually dissent during the war?
There are a range of different ways. I mean, not every dissident was a violent dissident. Not everybody was brave. But not all these people were paragons of morality either. There were lots of ways that they resisted. Some of my favorite are people who resisted Confederate currency, or people who resisted symbols of the Confederacy in interesting ways. They would run around and take down Confederate flags, or put up U.S. flags in their place in prominent positions. But some of my favorite are the people that celebrate the death of Stonewall Jackson publicly. celebrate whenever Confederates lose battles, even whenever they do it privately. It's interesting the way they talk about it as something that reinforced their loyalty, enabled them to survive the war, to survive their experience within this new Confederate world. It was just so jarring for these people. One day they wake up and they're in the antebellum Union, and the antebellum Union is protecting slavery for them, and the next day they wake up and it's a Confederate world that might endanger their very livelihood, their economic well-being. Some of these people, about 20% of them, own slaves. So they just feel like slavery's better off in the Union. It's always been protected in the Union. Why break up the Union? You might actually threaten slavery. You might lose it for those people who did own slaves. And there weren't a lot of large slaveholders among them, but about 20% of them did own slaves. So it's an interesting group, a very diverse group of people that we're talking about.
Right, and as you mentioned at the beginning here of the interview, you came at this originally from the perspective of guerrilla warfare.
Absolutely.
So I wondered if you could elaborate a bit more on how some of these dissidents become involved in irregular warfare. I realize I'm using terms here interchangeably that's not okay. If you read the book, it's very clear how you have different terms for different elements of the irregular scene. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how these Unionists become dissidents who become obviously involved in regular warfare, and how do Confederate authorities react to these guerrillas?
This is a really great question, Dave. First, I'll start with the Confederates, because I think this is something that really comes out. It's highlighted by the experience of the Unionists. Confederates never really understand the problem that they have on their hands with guerrilla warfare anywhere in the South. But in North Carolina, they definitely don't understand it. They don't understand it as a military problem the way we do today. They understand it as a criminal problem. And by understanding it as a criminal problem, they never really devote the resources necessary to try to deal with it. Even if they had been capable of devoting all the resources really necessary to quell what happens, they probably wouldn't have been able to. But if you read the enrolling officers, the home guards, commanders, the militia officers who are trying to deal with irregular warfare as it emerges, they're not talking about it in the sort of way that we talk about irregular warfare today or in the 20th century sense as a military problem that needs to be crushed. They talk about it as criminality, as an insurrection against the laws, as something that needed to be dealt with through civil officials that were just going to arrest these people and throw them in jail. They don't really get the full extent of it. Now, the flip side of this, how do people end up being pushed to violence? A couple of things the Confederates do force a lot of these people out into the open. So many of them would have been happy to have remained out of the way, stay at home peacefully, avoid any contact with the Confederacy. But they get drawn into the war by the Confederate Conscription Act in April of 1862. Confederate enrolling officers start coming to their house. They want their uncle, their brother, their cousin, their son. And that forces people into conflict with the Confederate government. It forces people at the local level into direct conflict with the Confederacy. In addition to that, the Confederates, the same month, April 1862, issued the Partisan Ranger Act. They start recruiting their own authorized guerrillas. Some of those people become a problem on the home front within North Carolina. So that's another dimension of this. A third type of guerrilla conflict emerges with this cross-border raiding warfare from Tennessee, from Virginia, from South Carolina into North Carolina. So there are a range of different problems that local Confederate North Carolina officials are facing whenever they see this. But Unionists get drawn in large part because of the Confederate government and its policy and resistance to that. But they're aided. This small kernel of Unionists are aided by deserters from the Confederate Army returning home. Somewhere between a quarter and a fifth of all the men from North Carolina who end up in the Army of Northern Virginia or the Army of Tennessee end up deserting to the home front. Somewhere between 14,000 and 25,000 men desert. About 21,000 are conscripts out of that 125,000 total that are recruited into the Confederate Army. So many of those guys desert as well. they end up joining these irregular wars that emerge on the home front, and it becomes an enormous problem.
Well, obviously, the war progresses, and then we move into 1865, and there's a need for reconciliation, a need for North Carolina to come back into the Union, and these individuals who were neighbors, some who were Unionists, some who allied with the Confederacy, are neighbors once more, and they need to attempt to coexist. But the undeniable fact is that some of these people were ardent Unionists, well known in the community as being those who supported the federal government from the beginning through the end. So what's the experience like for Unionists in the Reconstruction period?
I think that in Reconstruction, you continue to see persecution of these people. They were out, many of them. Their loyalties were well known to local Confederates within the community, and just because the Union Army comes in and liberates them, and that's how they viewed it as liberation, didn't mean that their war really ended. They do celebrate the victory of the Union Army, but some of them quickly become disillusioned because they don't feel like they're being rewarded for their stalwart defense of the Union, their persecution during the war. So they're a little bit jaded, many of them, in their attitudes toward the Union Army. Ex-Confederates, they continue to hold these people and their feet to the fire. It goes so badly that some of these Unionists are actually incarcerated after the war for their loyalty in local communities that are nominally in the restored United States. Some of these people are tortured after the war. Of course, the First Order, the Ku Klux Klan, persecutes them, comes to their houses, burns crosses in their yard. I mean, there are a range of things that the Klan does to these people. But ultimately, these people suffered defeat once again in the period of redemption. They're not really rewarded for all of the things that they put up with during the Confederate period. They try very hard to aid the Republican regime that emerges during Reconstruction, but ultimately there's just not enough of them to really roll back the tide. So, the story of Reconstruction here for them is one of economic decline by 1870. If we look at where they stand, you continue to see an economic decline for these people, and it's a sad story for many of these folks. I mean, they're destitute, and then they're persecuted on top of their destitution within their local communities. It's a sad story.
And finally, a bit of a softball, I guess I can throw at you. This book is done and dusted. What's the next project?
Well, I'm working on two things right now. One is an edited collection that I'm doing with co-editing with Brian McKnight down at the UVA at Wise. And it's a collection called The Guerrilla Hunters. It's going to bring together all the cutting-edge research, some of the best young scholars and more esteemed folks that are out there working in the guerrilla warfare field, even a couple of people who have never written on irregular warfare themselves ever, which I'm really excited about. I've got about 20 authors that are in the volume, and that should be coming in the next couple of months, and I'll be spending most of my time in the next year or so editing those pieces, adding my own contribution on the Partisan Rangers to that. But my next big project, I'm going to work on a new history of the Confederate War Department. More than 50,000 people worked for the Confederate War Department over the course of the 4 years of the war, 5 confirmed secretaries of war. I think it's the last great frontier for understanding Confederate military history. We have good histories of the Army in Northern Virginia. We have good histories of the Army of Tennessee, but we don't have a comprehensive history of the Confederate War Department. It managed the manpower, it managed the resources. In terms of really understanding the Confederacy and its war effort, both on the battlefield and on the asymmetrical field of battle, the guerrilla conflicts, I think the Confederate War Department is where we need to look in order to try to figure out once and for all why the battlefield and the unconventional battlefield mattered together, sort of synthesis. And I think that looking at the War Department will give us many of the answers that we're looking for. So that's where I'm headed in the future.
Sounds like a very full plate, but two very worthy projects of examination here. So, well, thank you so much, Dr. Myers, for coming on again to chat about your book. Again, everyone, that's Rebels Against the Confederacy, North Carolina's Unionists, out with Cambridge University Press. Really great read. Should mention, and you alluded to this, obviously, but the appendices in the back are really quite something and show that, quantitative analysis is something that historians can do, and it's something that we can all benefit from, and really involves a deeper understanding of some of our studies. So pick up the book, everyone, and it's out there, and you'll really enjoy it, and it'll give you a new perspective on the Tar Heel State, irregular warfare, and the struggles of Confederacy and Unionists during the war itself. So thanks again, Dr. Myers, and hopefully we can have you back on in the future to talk about a project.
Thanks again, Dave. I appreciate it.